The warm, golden lights of the small Texas town's only upscale restaurant cast a gentle glow over Cole West as he sat alone at his table. His presence, though restrained, carried an unspoken authority, a stark contrast to the locals gathered for a quiet evening. The hum of muted conversations, the clinking of cutlery against porcelain, and the occasional laughter created a comforting background noise. But Cole wasn't there for comfort. He was there out of necessity, closing yet another business deal that would further cement his empire. He was no longer the reckless playboy of his youth, but a man whose every move was deliberate, calculated. He barely noticed the two pairs of curious eyes studying him from a corner table, where a young girl and her twin sister whispered excitedly. Their faces, framed by dark curls, held a striking familiarity that he couldn't place, though his attention was elsewhere. His mind wrapped around the intricacies of his latest acquisition. It was only when the girl's hushed giggles turned to full-bodied laughter that he glanced over, a small, amused smile forming on his lips. "Those two have been staring at you for quite a while now," a waitress teased as she refilled his glass. "Must be your lucky night, Mr. West." Cole chuckled softly, more out of politeness than genuine amusement. He looked over at the girls again, and they quickly averted their eyes, one of them covering her mouth to stifle her laughter. Something about their faces tugged at a memory long buried, but it was fleeting, like the faintest hint of a dream slipping away upon waking. As the night progressed, he tried to shake off the strange sensation that settled in his chest. He was a man of logic and reason, but there was no denying the uncanny sense of recognition he felt. Who were they? The question nagged at him, pulling his thoughts away from the business matters he usually handled with effortless precision. When he finally got up to leave, his eyes wandered to the corner table once more. The girls were gone, their chairs empty, the table cleared. He paid his bill and stepped outside into the cool night air, shaking off the evening's unsettling undercurrent. It was probably nothing, just a coincidence. He'd seen countless faces in his life, many of them blending into a blurred mosaic of the past. But as he walked down the quiet street toward his car, the unease persisted. There was something unfinished, a loose end he couldn't quite grasp. He glanced back at the restaurant, half expecting to see those wide, inquisitive eyes peering at him again. Instead, the only movement was the breeze stirring the leaves on the trees, the only sound the faint hum of distant traffic. Cole sighed, pushing the thought away. He had enough on his plate without chasing shadows from his past. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, the image of those girls still lingering in the back of his mind like a persistent echo. He didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. A small ripple that would soon turn into a tidal wave, pulling him into a past he thought he had buried forever. Unbeknownst to him, those two girls were more than a fleeting encounter. They were the key to a revelation that would upend everything he thought he knew about his life, about Sarah, and about himself. The drive back to his hotel was quiet, the soft hum of the engine a soothing contrast to the turbulent thoughts swirling in Cole's mind. He rolled down the window slightly, letting the cool air wash over his face, hoping it would clear his head. But the memory of those girls kept resurfacing, pulling him back to a time he tried to forget. A time when he wasn't the composed, powerful man he was now, but someone reckless and lost. The hotel lobby was almost deserted when he arrived, the night concierge nodding politely as he made his way to the elevator. He stepped in and pressed the button for the top floor, leaning against the mirrored wall as the doors slid shut. His reflection stared back at him, eyes weary, lines of age and experience etched into his face. He had come so far from the man he used to be, but it seemed that no matter how much he tried to distance himself, the past had a way of catching up. The ding of the elevator brought him back to the present. As he walked down the hallway to his suite, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text message. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. "Cole, saw you were in town. Hope you're doing well. Reminds me of the old days, and Sarah." Sarah. He stood frozen in the hallway, the door to his suite just inches away, but the name on the screen held him in place. It had been years since anyone had mentioned her to him. Most people knew better. Sarah was a part of his life he'd shut away, a wound that had never fully healed. She had been everything he wasn't: driven, idealistic, a beacon of hope in his chaotic, hedonistic world. And then, just like that, she was gone. His fingers hovered over the screen. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? That he still thought about her? That he wondered what had happened? Why she had disappeared without a word? He shook his head, turning off the phone and slipping it back into his pocket. He pushed open the door to his suite and stepped inside, the silence of the room enveloping him like a shroud. Cole poured himself a glass of bourbon and sank into the plush armchair by the window, staring out at the twinkling lights of the town below. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his thoughts drifting back to the last time he had seen her. It had been a fight, a stupid, pointless fight, like so many they'd had in those final days. She had accused him of being selfish, of putting his ambitions and desires above everything else, and he had lashed out, defensive and hurt. He'd said things he couldn't take back, words that still echoed in his mind late at night when he couldn't sleep. She had left his apartment, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and he hadn't gone after her. He'd been too proud, too stubborn. He thought she would come back, that they'd figure it out like they always did. But she didn't. She had vanished from his life as suddenly as she had entered it, leaving only a void where her light had been. He had tried to move on, to fill that emptiness with work and women and endless nights of distraction. But nothing ever quite erased the ghost of her smile, the memory of her voice, the feel of her hand in his. And now, years later, a simple text message had brought it all rushing back. He drained his glass and set it down with a sigh. What had happened to her? Where had she gone? He had heard rumors, whispers of her working in some small town, doing pro bono work for those who couldn't afford a lawyer. It sounded like her, always fighting for the underdog, always standing up for what was right. But why hadn't she reached out to him? He had spent years wondering if she had ever thought about him, if she had regretted leaving the way she did. And now there were those girls. His mind kept circling back to them, the way they had looked at him with those eyes so familiar, so haunting. What if? He pushed the thought away, shaking his head. It was absurd. He had no children, no ties. Sarah would have told him. She wouldn't have kept something like that from him. And yet, the nagging doubt remained, a seed planted deep in his mind that refused to be uprooted. Cole stood and paced the room, his steps echoing in the silence. He had built a life of order and control, but in one night, everything had been thrown off balance. He needed to know. He needed answers. And there was only one person who could give them to him. Decision firm, he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. He didn't know where Sarah was, or even if she would agree to see him, but he had to try. He couldn't keep running from the past, couldn't keep pretending that he didn't care. Not anymore. The night air was crisp and cool as he stepped outside, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the hotel. He looked up at the stars, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast darkness, and felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He was going to find her. He was going to get the answers he needed, no matter what it took, because some ghosts weren't meant to be ignored, and some pasts couldn't stay buried forever. The next morning, Cole drove out of town with a sense of determination he hadn't felt in years. The highway stretched before him, winding through the rugged Texas landscape, a vast expanse of open fields and distant hills under the clear blue sky. The sun was high, its light sharp and unforgiving, as if reflecting his own unrelenting need for answers. He'd made a few calls before leaving the hotel, using the extensive network he'd built over the years. It hadn't taken long to track down a lead. Sarah was living in a small town a few hours away, practicing law at a tiny, understaffed legal aid office. It sounded like her, always drawn to where she was needed most, always fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But the thought of her there, alone and struggling, made something tighten in his chest. As the miles passed, his mind raced. What would he say to her after all this time? How would she react to seeing him again? The questions twisted inside him, but beneath them was a darker, more urgent fear. The fear that the answers he sought would be more painful than he could bear. When he finally reached the town, it was mid-afternoon. The streets were quiet, lined with weathered buildings that spoke of better days. He found the legal aid office tucked between a thrift store and a diner, its small sign barely visible from the road. He sat in his car for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before stepping out into the hot, dusty air. The office was cramped and cluttered, papers piled high on every available surface. A lone secretary looked up as he entered, her eyes widening slightly as she took in his tailored suit and commanding presence. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. "I'm here to see Sarah." "Sarah Evans," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The woman's expression shifted, a flicker of something, pity, concern, crossing her face. "I'm sorry, but she's not in the office today. Is there something I can pass along to her?" Cole shook his head, frustration and anxiety building inside him. "Do you know where I can find her?" The secretary hesitated, glancing down at her desk. "She's at home. I can give you the address, but," she trailed off, uncertainty clouding her features. "Are you a friend of hers?" "I used to be," he said quietly. "A long time ago." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she nodded and scribbled the address on a piece of paper. "Take care with her," she said softly as she handed it to him. "She's been through a lot." Cole didn't respond, his focus already shifting to the address in his hand. He murmured a quick thanks and turned to leave, his heart pounding as he made his way back to his car. He felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The drive to Sarah's house took only a few minutes. It was a small, modest home on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a neat but sparse garden. He parked on the street and sat for a moment, staring at the front door. This was it, the moment he'd been both craving and dreading. With a deep breath, he got out of the car and walked up the short path to the porch, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. He knocked, the sound sharp in the still afternoon. For a moment, there was no response, and he wondered if she was even home. But then he heard movement inside, soft footsteps approaching the door. It opened slowly, and there she was. Sarah. She looked different, and yet so achingly familiar. Her hair was shorter, streaked with gray, her face thinner and more lined than he remembered. But her eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were the same, holding a depth of emotion that took his breath away. "Cole," she said, her voice a soft exhale, a mix of shock and something else he couldn't quite name. "Sarah," he replied, his own voice strained, thick with emotions he hadn't realized he still carried. They stood there, a silence heavy between them, years of unspoken words hanging in the air. "What are you doing here?" she finally asked, her tone guarded but not hostile. "I needed to see you," he said simply, the truth of it stark and undeniable. "I needed to talk to you." She nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. Then she stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." The house was small but cozy, filled with the quiet warmth that seemed to be a part of her. He followed her into the living room, his eyes drifting over the bookshelves lined with law texts and novels, the family photos on the walls. Two young girls, smiling and bright-eyed, stared back at him from the pictures. His heart clenched. The girls from the restaurant. He turned to Sarah, his pulse racing. "Are they?" "Yes," she said softly, her voice breaking a little. "They're yours, Cole. They're our daughters." The words hit him like a punch, knocking the breath from his lungs. He stumbled back a step, shock and disbelief warring within him. "But why? Why didn't you tell me?" She looked away, her shoulders trembling. "I wanted to, but you were so lost back then, Cole. I didn't know how you would react. And then, when I finally decided to reach out, I found out." She paused, her voice choked with emotion. "I found out I was sick." His mind reeled, struggling to process everything. His daughters. She had been alone, raising their children, while he had been wrapped up in his world of wealth and power. And now she was sick. How sick, he didn't know, but the fear that gripped his heart told him it was bad. "Sarah," he began, but she shook her head, tears shining in her eyes. "I'm dying, Cole," she whispered, the words shattering the last remnants of his composure. "I wanted to give you a chance to know them, to be there for them, before it's too late." He stood there, the enormity of what she was saying crashing over him like a tidal wave. His daughters, Sarah's illness, the time they had lost. He had spent years running from his past, and now, when he finally faced it, he found it slipping away from him, piece by painful piece. "I'm so sorry," he choked out, his voice raw with regret. "For everything. For not being there." "I know," she said softly, her gaze steady and filled with a sad understanding. "I know." They stood there, two broken people bound by a love that had never truly died, even as it had been buried beneath years of pain and silence. And in that moment, Cole knew that whatever it took, he would be there for his daughters. He would be the father they deserved, the man Sarah had always believed he could be. Because he couldn't change the past. But maybe, just maybe, he could be a part of their future. The living room seemed to close in around him, the weight of Sarah's revelation pressing down like a physical force. Cole's mind raced, each thought tangling with the next as he tried to process the enormity of what she had just told him. His daughters. His. He turned back to the photos on the wall, the smiling faces of the twins staring back at him, and felt his heart constrict. How had he missed this? How had he been so blind? "They're beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "What are their names?" "Lila and Emma," Sarah replied, her voice soft and steady, though he could see the strain in her eyes. "They're 8 now." 8 years. He had missed 8 years of their lives, first steps, first words, birthdays, and bedtime stories. Regret flooded through him, an overwhelming sense of failure. He looked back at Sarah, struggling to find the right words, to make sense of it all. "I didn't know, Sarah. I swear I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking with the weight of his guilt. "If I had known." "I know, Cole." She cut him off gently, but firmly. "I know you didn't know, and maybe that's my fault too. I should have told you, should have reached out. But back then, you were—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "You were so lost, Cole, caught up in your own world, your own pain. I didn't know if you were ready to be a father." He flinched at the truth in her words. Back then, he had been a mess, a whirlwind of reckless decisions and self-destructive behavior. He remembered those days vividly. The late nights, the parties, the endless string of meaningless affairs. He had been running from something, but he hadn't known what. Now he realized he had been running from himself, from the guilt of losing her, from the life he'd shattered with his own hands. "You were right," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I wasn't ready. I was a selfish bastard, and I was too wrapped up in my own crap to see what I was losing." Sarah sighed, a soft, tired sound that spoke of years of pain and disappointment. "It wasn't just your fault, Cole. We were both broken in our own ways. I should have fought harder for us, should have tried to understand what you were going through. But I was so focused on my work, on the cases I was handling, that I didn't see how much you were hurting. And then—" Her voice trailed off, and Cole felt the distance between them, the chasm that had grown over the years. But he couldn't let it end there. He couldn't let the ghosts of their past keep haunting them. "And then you left," he finished for her, his voice low, but not accusing. Just the simple truth of it. "You left, and I thought I'd lost you forever." The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they couldn't say, all the wounds that had never healed. Finally, Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting his with a fierce intensity. "I had to, Cole. I had to leave to find myself again. And when I found out I was pregnant, I knew I couldn't go back to that life. I had to be strong. For them." He nodded, understanding now in a way he hadn't before. He could see it, the strength it must have taken for her to walk away, to build a new life for herself and their daughters without him. But it didn't make the regret any less sharp, the guilt any less consuming. "Do they know?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Do they know who I am?" Sarah shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "No, I never told them. I didn't want them to grow up resenting you, or feeling like they weren't enough. I wanted them to have a good childhood, without the weight of our past." It made sense, even though it hurt. He could see now why she had kept it from him, why she had chosen to protect their children from the chaos he had been. But the thought of them not knowing him, of being strangers to his own flesh and blood, was almost more than he could bear. "I want to know them, Sarah," he said, the words coming out raw and desperate. "I want to be there for them, to make up for all the time I've lost." She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching, measuring. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear of letting him in, of risking more pain for herself and their daughters. But then she nodded, a small, tentative gesture of hope. "They're at school right now," she said quietly, "but I'll talk to them tonight, see how they feel about meeting you. It's their choice, Cole. I won't force them." "Thank you," he whispered, emotion clogging his throat. "Thank you, Sarah." She nodded again, and they fell into silence, the air between them thick with unspoken words. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to tell her how sorry he was for everything that had happened. But he knew it wasn't that simple. They couldn't just erase the past, couldn't undo all the pain and mistakes. All they could do was move forward, one step at a time. "I should go," he said finally, his voice rough. "I'll give you some time, but please, let me know. Whatever they decide, I want to be a part of their lives." "I will," she promised, her voice soft but firm. "I will, Cole." He turned to leave, his heart heavy but filled with a glimmer of hope. As he reached the door, he glanced back at her, standing there with a look of quiet strength that took his breath away. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," he said softly. "You've done an amazing job. They're lucky to have you." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Cole. That means more than you know." He stepped outside, the afternoon sun warm on his face, and took a deep breath. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that there were no guarantees. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path, like he was finally facing his past instead of running from it. And no matter what happened next, he was ready to fight for his family, to be the man they needed him to be. Because this time, he wasn't going to let them down. Cole spent the next few days in a restless limbo, his mind occupied with thoughts of the daughters he had yet to meet and the woman who had changed his life forever. He found himself replaying every moment with Sarah, every word exchanged, every look that spoke of a love and pain too deep to express. He couldn't shake the image of her standing there, eyes bright with unshed tears as she told him she was dying. The realization hit him again and again, a brutal reminder of the fragility of time. He knew he had to act fast, to prove to Sarah and to himself that he could be the father his daughters deserved. But there was another layer to it, one he hadn't expected. The desperate need to make things right with Sarah before it was too late. He needed her to see that he was no longer the reckless, selfish man she had left behind. He stayed in a small, nondescript motel on the edge of town, close enough to feel connected but far enough to give Sarah the space she needed. Every evening, he found himself sitting by the phone, waiting for it to ring, his heart racing at every buzz and vibration. And then, finally, it came. "Cole?" Sarah's voice was soft, tentative, as if she were still unsure about calling him. "Sarah," he breathed, relief and anxiety washing over him in equal measure. "How are you? How are the girls?" "They're okay," she said, her words careful. "We talked last night. They're curious, confused. I tried to explain as best I could, but it's a lot for them to process." He closed his eyes, trying to imagine the conversation, the questions, the emotions. "I can't imagine what they must be feeling. I want to be whatever they need me to be, Sarah. I'm not here to force myself into their lives." "I know," she said gently, "but they want to meet you, Cole. They want to see who you are." His heart skipped a beat. "Really?" "Yes. They're nervous, but they're ready to meet their father." The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between his past mistakes and the future he desperately wanted to build. He knew this was just the beginning, that meeting them was the first step in what would be a long, uncertain journey. But it was a start, and he would take it. "When?" he asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of his voice. "Tomorrow afternoon. We'll be at the park near their school. I thought it might be easier for them to meet you somewhere familiar." "Thank you, Sarah. I mean it. Thank you for this chance." She paused, and he could almost feel her weighing his sincerity, measuring it against the man she had known. Just be yourself, Cole. They need to see who you are, not who you think they want you to be. I will, he promised, his voice steady. I'll be there. They hung up, and Cole sat back, his heart pounding. Tomorrow. He would see them tomorrow. He tried to imagine what it would be like, but his mind couldn't settle on anything concrete. Would they look at him with curiosity, or would they see him as a stranger, someone who had failed them before he even knew they existed? The next day dawned bright and clear, the sky a perfect, cloudless blue. Cole arrived at the park early, too restless to sit still in his motel room. He wandered the paths, his mind racing, trying to calm the storm of emotions churning inside him. He watched families playing, children laughing, and felt an ache deep in his chest. He had missed so much. He spotted them before they saw him. Sarah walking hand in hand with the two girls, her movements slower, more deliberate than he remembered. His breath caught in his throat as he took them in, the sight of them more powerful than he had expected. They were beautiful, just like their mother, their dark hair catching the sunlight, their faces filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Lila, the slightly taller of the two, held her head high, her eyes scanning the park with a cautious curiosity. Emma clung closer to Sarah, her gaze more guarded, her small hand clutching tightly to her mother's. They looked so small, so vulnerable, and he felt a fierce, protective surge of love that surprised him with its intensity. Sarah spotted him first, her eyes meeting his across the distance. She gave him a small, encouraging smile, and he took a deep breath, forcing his legs to move, to close the space between them. "Hi," he said softly as he approached, his heart pounding in his chest. He crouched down, trying to make himself less imposing. "You must be Lila and Emma." The girls glanced at each other, then back at him. Lila's brow furrowed slightly, as if she were trying to puzzle him out. "You're our dad?" "Yes," he said, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to stay calm. "I am. And I know this is really weird and probably a little scary, but I'm really happy to meet you both." Emma's eyes narrowed slightly, her grip tightening on Sarah's hand. "Where were you?" The question, blunt and direct, hit him like a punch. He glanced up at Sarah, who gave him a small nod, urging him to answer honestly. "I didn't know about you," he said, looking back at Emma, his gaze steady. "I didn't know you existed until a few days ago. But that doesn't excuse anything. I should have been there, and I'm so sorry that I wasn't." Emma's gaze softened just a fraction, her eyes searching his face. Lila was watching him closely, her expression still wary but less guarded than before. "Why are you here now?" Lila asked, her voice small but clear. "Because I want to know you," he said simply. "I want to be a part of your lives, if you'll let me. I know I've missed a lot, and I can't get that time back, but I want to be here for you now, in any way you need me." The girls exchanged another look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then Lila took a step forward, her eyes still cautious but curious. "Do you like ice cream?" The question caught him off guard, and he let out a small, surprised laugh. "I love ice cream." She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "There's a place over there," she said, pointing to a stand across the park. "They have the best flavors." Cole's heart swelled with hope. "Well, I guess we'd better go check it out then." He glanced at Sarah, who gave him a small nod of encouragement, and then back at the girls. "Shall we?" They started walking together, the girls flanking him, still keeping a slight distance, but no longer looking at him like he was a complete stranger. Sarah followed behind, a small smile playing on her lips as she watched them. He knew this was just the beginning, a tiny step forward, but it felt monumental. As they reached the ice cream stand, Lila and Emma chattered excitedly about their favorite flavors, their nervousness slowly melting away in the face of their shared excitement. Cole listened, his heart lifting with every word, every smile. This was what he had been missing, the small, everyday moments that made up a life. He glanced back at Sarah, catching her eye, and she smiled, a look of quiet pride and relief on her face. He smiled back, his heart filled with gratitude. This was Sarah's gift to him, this chance to be a father, to make up for the lost time. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And he wasn't going to waste a single moment of it. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. Over the next few weeks, Cole found himself navigating uncharted territory. Each day brought new challenges, awkward moments, and tentative steps forward as he tried to build a relationship with his daughters. He spent more time in the small town than he had anticipated, putting his business on hold, his mind and heart focused on just one goal: becoming a part of Lila and Emma's lives. The initial meeting at the park had been a small victory, but he knew better than to expect an easy road ahead. The girls were curious but cautious, eager but guarded. They had lived their entire lives without a father, and now here he was, a stranger claiming that title. The weight of what he had missed hung heavily over every interaction, but he was determined to earn their trust, one day at a time. The first real test came one Saturday afternoon when he took them out for lunch. They sat in a small, bustling diner. The girls huddled together in the booth, their eyes darting around, taking everything in. Cole could feel the distance between them, a tangible space that only time and patience could bridge. He tried to break the ice, asking them about school, their friends, what they liked to do for fun. Lila answered in short, polite sentences, her eyes flicking to Emma as if seeking approval before speaking. Emma was more reserved, her gaze flitting to the window, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. He knew she was the more guarded of the two, her trust harder to win. "What's your favorite subject in school?" he asked, hoping to find some common ground. "Science," Lila said after a moment. "We're learning about space right now." Cole's face brightened. "Space? I used to love learning about the stars and planets when I was your age. I even had a telescope." He smiled, hoping to catch a spark of interest. Lila glanced at him, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "Really? Really? I used to sneak out onto the roof at night to look at the stars. My mom always thought I was asleep, but I'd be out there for hours, just staring at the sky." A small smile tugged at Lila's lips. "Did you ever see a shooting star?" "A few," Cole said, leaning forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "And every time I made a wish." "What did you wish for?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. He paused, the question striking deeper than he had expected. He thought of his childhood, of dreams and wishes long forgotten, buried under years of ambition and regret. What would he wish for now, if he had the chance? "I wished for adventure," he said finally, a soft smile on his lips. "To see the world, to have a life full of excitement." "Did you get your wish?" Lila asked, her eyes wide and sincere. He hesitated, glancing at Emma, who was now watching him closely, her expression thoughtful. "I did, in a way. But sometimes you get what you wish for, and it's not what you thought it would be." Emma's brow furrowed, her voice quiet but insistent. "Like what?" "Like being far away from the people who matter most," he said, his gaze steady. "Like realizing too late that the real adventure is right in front of you, and you almost missed it." There was a silence, the weight of his words settling between them. Lila nodded slowly, her small hand reaching for her sister's under the table, squeezing gently. Emma glanced at her, then back at Cole, a flicker of something. Understanding, maybe, softening her gaze. "Can we get dessert?" Emma asked, her voice still quiet but a little less wary. Cole smiled, his heart lifting at the small but significant shift. "Absolutely. What's your favorite?" "Chocolate cake," she said, and Lila nodded in agreement. "2 slices of chocolate cake coming right up," he said, signaling the waitress. As they waited, the conversation drifted to lighter topics, their favorite TV shows, the games they liked to play. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of awkward silence, but it was a start. He felt the barriers between them slowly, cautiously, beginning to lower. When the cake arrived, he watched as they dug in, their faces lighting up with delight. He found himself smiling, the joy in their simple pleasure filling him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. This was what he had been missing, the small, everyday moments that made up a life, a family. "Can we go to the park after?" Lila asked, her eyes bright. There's a place where we can feed the ducks. Cole nodded, his chest tight with a mix of emotions. Of course. I'd love that. They spent the afternoon wandering the park, the girls leading him to their favorite spots, showing him the world through their eyes. They fed the ducks, their laughter echoing in the still air, a sound so pure it made his heart ache. He watched them, his daughters, and felt something deep inside him begin to heal. But it wasn't all easy. There were setbacks, moments when the walls between them seemed too high to climb. Emma, especially, would retreat into herself, pulling away whenever she felt overwhelmed. It hurt, but he understood. Trust wasn't built in a day, or even a week. He had to be patient, had to show them with every action that he was there for the long haul. One evening, as he walked them back to Sarah's house, Emma trailed behind, her face a mask of quiet contemplation. Lila skipped ahead, chattering about the new book she was reading, but Emma's silence worried him. "Emma," he asked gently, falling into step beside her, "is everything okay?" She looked up at him, her eyes shadowed with a sadness that took his breath away. "Are you going to leave?" she asked, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. "Like before?" The question hit him like a punch. He crouched down, meeting her gaze, his heart breaking at the vulnerability in her eyes. "No, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I'm not leaving. I promise." She searched his face, her small hand reaching out to touch his, as if testing the truth of his words. "Do you mean it?" "I do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I mean it, Emma. I'm not going anywhere." She nodded slowly, and then, to his surprise, she leaned forward and hugged him, her arms wrapping around his neck. He held her close, his eyes stinging with unshed tears, overwhelmed by the depth of his love for this little girl he had only just begun to know. "Okay," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Okay." As they continued walking, Emma's hand stayed in his, her grip tight and trusting. He glanced back at Sarah, who stood watching them from the porch, her eyes filled with a quiet pride and gratitude. He nodded to her, a silent promise in his gaze. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. And no matter how difficult it got, he was determined to see it through, because they were his family, and he wasn't going to let them down again. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of tentative steps and breakthroughs, small moments of laughter interspersed with the lingering shadows of uncertainty. Cole's bond with Lila and Emma grew stronger each day, their trust in him deepening with every shared experience. They still had their hesitations, their guarded moments, but he could feel the invisible walls slowly crumbling. And amidst this fragile new beginning, the reality of Sarah's condition loomed, an ever-present reminder of the time they didn't have. One afternoon, Cole sat on the front porch of Sarah's house, watching the girls play in the yard. They were chasing each other with shrieks of laughter, their hair streaming behind them like dark banners in the wind. He smiled, his heart full, but there was an ache beneath his happiness, a sharp-edged sorrow that refused to fade. Sarah's absence was a tangible thing, a weight pressing down on him. She had been spending more and more time resting, her strength waning, and it terrified him. The screen door creaked open behind him, and he turned to see Sarah stepping out, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked so small, so fragile, that it took his breath away. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with pain and exhaustion, but she managed to smile as she joined him on the porch. "Hey," she said softly, settling into the chair beside him. "They seem happy." "They do," he agreed, his voice gentle. "You've done an incredible job with them, Sarah." She shrugged, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "I've done my best, but it's good to see them with you. They need you, Cole." "And I need them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I need all of you." A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken fears. He glanced at her, taking in the lines of pain etched around her eyes, the tremor in her hands. He knew the prognosis wasn't good, but he had been too afraid to ask, too afraid to know how little time they might have left. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and hesitant, "I've been meaning to ask, is there anything else I can do? Anything you need?" She looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. "Cole, there's something I need to tell you." He froze, his heart pounding. The seriousness in her voice, the weight in her eyes. It felt like the ground shifting beneath him. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to where the girls were playing, their laughter ringing through the air. "When I left all those years ago, it wasn't just because I was angry or hurt. I was scared, Cole. Scared of what we were becoming, of what I was becoming." He frowned, leaning closer. "What do you mean?" "I was losing myself," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so wrapped up in trying to save you, to save us, that I forgot how to take care of myself. And then, when I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if you'd even want to be a father, or if it would push you further away." The confession hit him like a punch, knocking the breath from his lungs. He had always thought she left because he had failed her, because he wasn't enough. He had never considered that she had been struggling too, that she had been trying to protect herself as much as him. "I would have wanted to know, Sarah," he said, his voice raw. "I would have wanted to be there, even if I didn't know how to be." "I know that now," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But back then, I couldn't see past my own fear. And by the time I felt ready to reach out, to tell you about the girls, I got the diagnosis." He felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. He reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "What are you saying, Sarah? That you've been sick this whole time?" She nodded, her gaze steady, unflinching. "It was early then, just a few symptoms. The doctors said it might not progress for years. I thought I had time to figure things out, to get my life in order before I involved you. But then it got worse, faster than they expected. By the time I knew how bad it was, I didn't know how to tell you." Cole's chest constricted, his heart breaking for the pain and fear she must have gone through alone. He thought of all the times he had cursed her for leaving, for keeping him away from his daughters, and felt a wave of shame and guilt so powerful it almost knocked him over. "I should have been there," he whispered, his voice choked. "I should have known." "No, Cole," she said firmly, squeezing his hand. "Don't do that. Don't blame yourself. You didn't know. And I wasn't ready to let you in. Not when I was still trying to find my own way. I made my choices, and I don't regret them, because they gave me Lila and Emma. But you shouldn't have had to go through this alone," he said, his eyes stinging with tears. "You should have had someone to lean on, to help you. I could have been that for you." "I know," she said softly, her voice breaking. "But I was so afraid, Cole. Afraid that I'd ruin your life, that you'd feel trapped, resentful. I didn't want that for you, or for them. So I thought I could handle it on my own." He shook his head, a sob building in his chest. "You didn't have to protect me, Sarah. I would have been there. I would have been there for all of you." "I know that now," she whispered, her own tears falling. "But it's too late for regrets. We have to focus on now, on what's left." He nodded, wiping at his eyes. "Then let me be here for you now, for all of you. Let me make up for lost time, for all the things I should have done." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a fierce, aching love. "You already are, Cole. You're here now, and that's what matters. They need you, and you're showing them that they can trust you. That's the greatest gift you could give me." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her fragile frame, holding her as if he could keep her from slipping away. She rested her head on his shoulder, her body trembling with the force of her emotions. "I'm so scared," she whispered, the words breaking his heart. "I'm scared of leaving them, of what will happen when I'm gone." "You don't have to be scared," he murmured, his voice fierce with determination. "I'll take care of them, Sarah. I swear to you. I'll be the father they need, the one they deserve. I won't let you down." She pulled back, looking up at him with a sad, beautiful smile. "I know you won't. I've seen how much you've changed, how much you love them. You're already more than I could have hoped for." They stayed there, wrapped in each other's arms, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Cole felt the enormity of what lay ahead, the inevitable loss that loomed over them. But he also felt something else, a fierce, unyielding resolve. He would be strong for his daughters, for Sarah. He would honor her love, her sacrifices, by being the father and man she had always believed he could be. And as he held her, the weight of her body against his, he made a silent vow. No matter what happened, he would carry on her legacy. He would raise their daughters with the strength, courage, and compassion that she had shown every day of her life. He would ensure that they knew how much she loved them, that they felt her presence in every choice, every action, every word. Because love didn't die, even when people did. It lived on, in the hearts of those left behind. And Cole would make sure that Sarah's love, her spirit, would never be forgotten. In the days that followed Sarah's confession, a new rhythm settled over the house. A fragile, temporary peace infused with an urgency Cole could feel in every breath. It was as if time itself was speeding up, carrying them toward an inevitable end they were all trying to ignore. He spent his days balancing the delicate needs of his daughters and the looming reality of Sarah's illness, his heart constantly pulled in two directions. The mornings were filled with routine. Breakfast together, walks to school, and whispered reassurances that he would be waiting for them at the end of the day. He made it a point to be there every afternoon, standing by the school gates as Lila and Emma emerged, their faces lighting up when they saw him. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. He knew they were still watching him, testing his promises, waiting to see if he would disappear like a mirage the moment they let themselves believe he was real. In the evenings, after the girls were asleep, he would sit with Sarah on the porch, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Sometimes they talked, reminiscing about the past, sharing stories about the girls that made them laugh and cry. Other times, they just sat in silence, the weight of everything they couldn't say pressing down on them. Each night, he felt the clock ticking faster, the moments slipping through his fingers like sand. One night, after putting the girls to bed, Cole found Sarah in the living room, hunched over a stack of papers. She looked up as he entered, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes clear and focused. "Hey," he said softly, crossing the room to sit beside her. "What's all this?" She sighed, her gaze dropping to the documents spread out on the table. "It's everything. The legal stuff, the finances, the will. I've been trying to get it all in order, so it's not a mess for you and the girls when I'm gone." The word hung in the air, heavy and final, and Cole felt his chest tighten. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "Sarah, you don't have to do this alone. I'm here. Let me help." She gave him a sad smile, her fingers tightening around his. "I know, Cole, but some of this, it's hard to let go of. I've been their everything for so long. It's hard to trust that someone else will take care of them the way I would." His heart ached at the truth in her words, at the fear he could see in her eyes. He had spent so many years running from responsibility, from the weight of being needed, and now, faced with the enormity of it, he felt both humbled and terrified. "I swear to you, Sarah," he said, his voice steady and firm, "I will take care of them. I will love them, protect them, give them everything they need. You don't have to worry about that. You can trust me." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, and then she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I do trust you, Cole. I want to make sure they remember me. I want them to know who I was, how much I loved them." "They will," he promised, his voice breaking. "I'll make sure they know. I'll tell them every day, every chance I get." She smiled, a small, fragile thing, and then she leaned forward, resting her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, wishing he could somehow keep her safe, keep her here. But he knew, in the deepest part of himself, that she was already slipping away, that no matter how tightly he held on, he couldn't stop what was coming. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt, "for being here, for coming back." "I should have never left," he said, his voice rough with regret. "I should have been here from the beginning." "We both made mistakes," she murmured, pulling back to look at him. "But you're here now, and that's what matters." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I love you, Sarah. I always have. I wish I'd been better for you, for them." "You're the best version of yourself now," she said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "That's all I ever wanted." They sat together in the quiet, holding on to each other, letting the words they couldn't say fill the space between them. He wanted to tell her everything. How much he admired her strength, her courage, how proud he was of the life she had built for their daughters. But the words stuck in his throat, too big, too heavy, so he just held her, letting the silence speak for him. The next morning, he found Sarah's will on the kitchen table, neatly signed and dated. He stared at it for a long time, his heart aching at the sight of her careful handwriting, the way she had meticulously planned every detail. It was her final act of love, of protection, and he felt the weight of it settle over him like a mantle. Over the next few days, he threw himself into being the father his daughters needed. He picked them up from school, helped with homework, took them on small adventures around town. A trip to the local zoo, a movie night with popcorn and laughter, a lazy Sunday afternoon spent painting in the backyard. He could feel them warming to him, the hesitant smiles turning into something more genuine, the guarded glances becoming less frequent. But it wasn't without challenges. Emma, especially, still struggled to let him in. There were moments when she would pull away, her eyes dark with suspicion, as if she were waiting for him to prove her fears right, to disappear just like every other person she had ever loved. He didn't push, didn't try to force a connection. He just kept showing up every day, his presence a constant reassurance that he wasn't going anywhere. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, Lila turned to him, her small face serious. "Daddy, what's going to happen when she's not here anymore?" The question hit him like a blow, and he had to take a deep breath before answering. "We'll still be a family," he said softly. "We'll take care of each other, and we'll keep her memory alive in everything we do." Lila nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't want to forget her." "You won't, sweetheart," he promised, his voice steady. "She'll always be a part of us. In the way we laugh, in the stories we tell, in the love we have for each other." Emma, who had been quiet, looked up, her gaze piercing. "You promise you'll stay?" "I promise," he said, his voice strong and sure. "I'll be here for you, no matter what. You're my girls, and I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, her small body relaxing a fraction, and for the first time, he saw a spark of something like trust in her eyes. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. As the days turned into weeks, he watched Sarah's strength ebb away, each day taking a little more from her. She spent most of her time resting now, her energy depleted, but she still smiled when she saw him, still reached for his hand when he sat beside her. One afternoon, as he was reading to her, she looked up, her eyes soft with love and something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. "Cole," she whispered, her voice weak but clear, "promise me one more thing." "Anything," he said, his heart breaking at the sight of her. So small and fragile in the bed they had moved to the living room so she could watch the girls play outside. "Promise me you'll live, really live. Don't just survive for them. Be happy, find joy, love again. They need to see you happy, to know it's okay to keep living, to keep loving." He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. She smiled, a small, contented smile, and then closed her eyes, her hand still clasped in his. He stayed there long after she had fallen asleep, her words echoing in his mind. He knew it would be hard, that the road ahead was filled with pain and loss, but he also knew that he would keep his promise. For Sarah, for Lila and Emma, and for himself. Because in the end, love was all that mattered. And he would make sure that, no matter what, their love would endure. The day Sarah passed was quiet and still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Cole sat by her bedside, holding her hand, the sound of the girls playing outside a gentle backdrop to the harsh reality unfolding in the small living room. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft, golden glow over Sarah's face, making her look almost ethereal, as if she were already half gone from this world. She had woken that morning with a peaceful smile, her eyes clear, her voice stronger than it had been in days. She had kissed Lila and Emma, whispering words of love and encouragement, her hands trembling as she held them close. Cole watched, his heart breaking with every smile, every tear, knowing this was their goodbye, that she was saying the things she needed to say before she let go. When the girls finally went outside to play, Sarah turned to him, her gaze filled with a calm acceptance that both comforted and terrified him. "It's time, Cole," she said softly, her voice a whisper of the strength it once held. "I'm ready." He shook his head, his throat tight with the words he couldn't force out. He wasn't ready. He would never be ready. How could he say goodbye to her, to the woman who had changed his life, who had given him the greatest gifts he could ever ask for? "Stay with me, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Just a little longer." "I'm here," she murmured, her fingers brushing his cheek, her touch feather-light. "I'm always with you. Always." He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, his tears mingling with hers. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sound the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing, the quiet ticking of the clock marking the moments slipping away. "I love you, Sarah," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I love you so much." "I love you too," she said, her breath warm against his skin. "Take care of them, Cole. Take care of yourself. Promise me." "I promise," he choked out, his heart breaking with each word. "I promise." Her smile was soft, content, as if she were already dreaming, already drifting away. He held her hand, his eyes never leaving her face, watching as she took one last, deep breath and then nothing. The world stopped. Time stopped. Everything stilled. The quiet so profound it was almost suffocating. He sat there, frozen, his heart pounding in the silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen, for her to take another breath, for her eyes to open. But she was gone. He felt it like a physical blow, the absence of her, the hollow, aching void where she had been. His chest constricted, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, the tears streaming down his face unchecked. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Sarah, please." But she didn't answer. She was gone, and he was alone. He stayed there for what felt like hours, holding her hand, his head bowed, his heart shattered. He didn't know how to move, how to breathe, how to exist in a world without her. The weight of his grief, his regret, was suffocating, pulling him under, drowning him in a sea of sorrow and pain. It wasn't until he heard the soft creak of the screen door that he finally looked up. Lila and Emma stood in the doorway, their eyes wide and fearful, their small bodies trembling as they looked at him, at Sarah's still form on the bed. "Daddy?" Lila whispered, her voice breaking. "Is Mommy?" He felt his heart shatter all over again as he nodded, his voice a broken whisper. "She's gone, sweetheart. Mommy's gone." The girls moved slowly toward the bed, their eyes fixed on Sarah, their faces pale and stricken. Emma reached out, her hand shaking, and touched Sarah's arm, her small fingers brushing against her mother's still warm skin. "Why?" she whispered, her voice filled with a raw, aching pain. "Why did she have to go?" Cole pulled them close, his arms wrapping around their small, fragile bodies, his tears mingling with theirs as he held them, his heart breaking for their pain, for the loss they couldn't yet comprehend. "I don't know, baby," he murmured, his voice trembling. "I don't know, but she loved you so much. She'll always be with us, in our hearts." They stayed like that, huddled together, their sobs the only sound in the quiet room. The grief was overwhelming, a suffocating, all-consuming thing, but he held on to them, grounding himself in their presence, their need. He had to be strong, had to be there for them, even though he felt like he was falling apart. The days that followed were a blur of tears and pain, of planning and arrangements, of trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. The funeral was small, a quiet affair in the town cemetery, the people who had known and loved Sarah gathering to say their goodbyes. Cole stood beside Lila and Emma, his hands gripping theirs, his heart breaking all over again as he watched the casket being lowered into the ground. He spoke softly to the girls, his voice steady, reassuring, even as his own grief threatened to overwhelm him. He told them stories about their mother, about her strength, her kindness, her love for them. He wanted them to remember her as she had been, full of life and laughter, not the fragile, fading woman she had become in those final days. "We'll keep her with us in everything we do," he said, his voice trembling. "We'll make her proud every day." Lila nodded, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "She'll always be in our hearts, right, Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Always." After the funeral, they returned to the house, the emptiness of it almost unbearable. The girls went to their room, seeking comfort in each other's presence, and Cole found himself alone in the living room, surrounded by the echoes of their life together. He felt lost, untethered, as if he were floating in a vast, empty space with no way to find his way back. He wandered through the house, his fingers brushing over the bookshelves, the photos on the walls, the little mementos of Sarah's life. He found her journal on the bedside table, the pages filled with her neat, precise handwriting, and he sat down, his hands trembling as he opened it. The entries were a mixture of everyday moments and thoughts, of hopes and fears, of love and pain. He read through them slowly, his heart aching with every word, feeling as if he were hearing her voice again, soft and clear in the silence. In one of the final entries, written just a few weeks before, she had talked about him, about how proud she was of the man he had become, about how much she loved him, even after everything they had been through. "You're doing so well, Cole," she had written. "You're being the father they need, the man I always knew you could be. I'm not afraid anymore, because I know you'll take care of them. I know you'll keep them safe, keep them loved. Thank you for that. Thank you for coming back." He closed the journal, his vision blurred with tears, his heart breaking all over again. He sat there for a long time, the house silent around him, the weight of her words, her love, settling over him like a warm, comforting blanket. When he finally stood, he felt a strange sense of peace, of purpose. He knew the road ahead would be hard, that the grief would never truly leave them, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had Lila and Emma, and they had him, and together, they would find a way to keep going, to keep living. He went to the girls' room, finding them curled up together on the bed, their eyes red and swollen from crying. He lay down beside them, pulling them close, his arms wrapped around them, his heart full of love and pain and hope. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, his voice steady and sure. "It's going to be hard, and it's going to hurt, but we'll get through this. We'll do it together." They nodded, their small hands clutching at his shirt, their bodies pressed close to his. He held them, his heart breaking and mending all at once, feeling the weight of his promise, of his love for them, settle over him like a second skin. Because Sarah had been right. Love didn't die. It lived on, in the hearts of those left behind, in the memories they carried, in the lives they built. And he would make sure that, no matter what, they would live, they would love, they would carry her with them, always. It was the only way he knew how to honor her, to keep her with them, to make sure that her light, her love, never faded. Because she was a part of them, a part of him, forever. The first year without Sarah was a blur of grief and resilience. Every day, a delicate dance between honoring her memory and building a new life for their family. Cole felt the weight of his promises every morning as he got up to make breakfast, every evening when he tucked the girls into bed. Each day brought its own set of challenges, but he faced them head-on, determined to keep moving forward, to create a life that would make Sarah proud. Lila and Emma were his anchors, their small hands pulling him back from the edge whenever the darkness threatened to consume him. He saw so much of Sarah in them, in Lila's fierce determination, in Emma's quiet strength, and that both comforted and haunted him. But he held on to those pieces of her, weaving them into the fabric of their new life, finding solace in the way her spirit lived on through their daughters. The girls adjusted to their new reality with a resilience that amazed him. They had their moments of tears and anger, of asking why their mother had been taken from them, but they also had moments of joy, of laughter that filled the house with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Slowly, they began to heal, to find their way back to a semblance of normalcy. Cole did his best to be the father they needed, to be present in every moment, to give them a sense of security and love that he had once thought himself incapable of providing. He enrolled them in therapy, found support groups, and made sure they knew it was okay to talk about their mother, to keep her memory alive in their own way. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Lila turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. "Daddy, do you think Mommy can see us? Do you think she knows we're okay?" The question, innocent and profound, took him by surprise. He looked at her, then at Emma, who was watching him with the same curious, searching gaze. "I think she does," he said softly, his voice steady. "I think she's watching over us, and she's so proud of you both. I know she misses you just as much as you miss her." Emma nodded, her small hand slipping into his. "I want to make her proud." "You do, sweetheart," he whispered, his heart swelling with love and pride. Every single day, they fell into a comfortable silence, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows over the yard. It was moments like these, quiet and simple, that reminded him of what he was fighting for, of the life they were building together. As the months passed, they found a new rhythm, a new sense of normal. Cole started taking on work again, balancing his responsibilities as a father with his commitments to his business. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of it all felt like too much, when he wondered if he was really doing enough for the girls, if he was living up to the promises he had made to Sarah. But every time doubt crept in, he looked at Lila and Emma, at the way they smiled, at the light in their eyes, and he knew he was doing the right thing. He was there for them, in a way he had never been for anyone before. And they were thriving, growing more confident, more secure in the knowledge that he was there to catch them, no matter what. One day, just over a year after Sarah's passing, Cole took the girls to a quiet spot by the lake, a place Sarah had loved. They brought flowers, a small bouquet of wildflowers they had picked together, and sat by the water, the breeze ruffling their hair, the sunlight dancing on the surface of the lake. "We wanted to do something special today," Cole said, his voice gentle, "to remember Mommy, to celebrate her life." He watched as Lila and Emma laid the flowers on the water, their expressions solemn and peaceful. They each said a few words, small, heartfelt messages to their mother, their voices carrying softly on the breeze. He felt a swell of pride and sorrow, his heart aching with love for them, for Sarah, for everything they had lost and everything they had gained. When it was his turn, he took a deep breath, the words catching in his throat. "Sarah, we miss you every day, but we're doing okay. The girls are amazing, strong and brave, just like you. They're growing up so fast, and I see you in them every day. Thank you for trusting me, for believing I could do this. I'll never stop trying to be the father they deserve, to honor your memory in everything I do. We love you, always." He watched the flowers drift away, carried by the current, and felt a sense of peace settle over him. It was still hard, and he knew it always would be, but he also knew that they were going to be okay. They had each other, and they had the love and strength Sarah had given them. That was enough. As they sat there, the girls leaning against him, their small bodies warm and solid, he felt something shift inside him. For so long, he had been defined by his mistakes, by the regrets that had haunted him. But now, for the first time, he felt a sense of acceptance, of peace. He wasn't perfect, he never would be, but he was here, doing his best, and that was enough. They stayed by the lake until the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky awash in hues of pink and gold. As they walked back to the car, Lila slipped her hand into his, looking up at him with a smile that made his heart ache with love. "Daddy?" "Yeah, sweetheart? Can we come back here every year, to remember Mommy?" He felt his throat tighten, his eyes stinging with tears. "Of course we can," he said softly. "We can come back as often as you want." Emma nodded, her face serious. "I like it here. It feels like her." Cole smiled, his heart full. "It does, doesn't it?" They drove home in silence, the peaceful quiet of the evening wrapping around them like a blanket. When they got back, Cole tucked the girls into bed, his heart swelling with love and gratitude as he kissed their foreheads, their sleepy smiles filling him with a warmth he had thought he would never feel again. As he stood in the doorway, watching them drift off to sleep, he felt a sense of contentment, of purpose. This was his life now, messy, imperfect, filled with challenges and heartache. But it was also filled with love, with the promise of a future that, for the first time in years, felt hopeful. He knew there would be more hard days, more moments when the loss of Sarah would hit him like a tidal wave. But he also knew they would get through it, together, because that's what Sarah had given them, each other, a family forged in love and loss, in hope and resilience. And as he turned off the light and closed the door, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet, steady certainty that they were going to be okay. They would carry Sarah with them, in their hearts, in their memories, in the life they were building together. They would honor her every day in the way they loved, in the way they lived. And in that, she would never truly be gone. Because love was the one thing that could never be taken away. It was the legacy she had left them, the gift that would guide them through every challenge, every joy, every moment of their lives. And that, Cole knew, was more than enough. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.